was blindsided. I never saw that one coming.
There was a break in the filming, and we had talked about it, and I just felt the urge.
Gary Oldman has spent nearly 5 decades disappearing into other people. Dracula, Sirius Black, Winston Churchill, Jackson Lamb. But there's one chapter of his own life he has never fully managed to vanish from, a short, strange marriage to a teenage Uma Thurman, decades before either of them became the icons the world now recognizes. What actually happened between them is far less mysterious than tabloid retellings suggest, but it is, in its own quiet way, one of the more revealing stories in either star's biography. Gary Oldman was born Gary Leonard Oldman on March 21, 1958, in London, the son of a sailor-turned-welder who struggled with alcoholism and left the family when Gary was 7 years old. That early instability shaped him. By the time he trained at Rose Bruford College and began working in British theater, he had already developed the raw, unpredictable intensity that would define his early screen work, an energy that made directors trust him with dangerous, unstable characters, and that also, by his own later admission, made his personal life difficult to manage. In 1987, Oldman married British actress Leslie Manville. Their son, Alfie, was born the following year, but the marriage did not last. According to Manville, the couple separated only months after Alfie's birth, and their divorce was finalized in 1990. It was a fast unraveling, and it came at a moment when Oldman's career was accelerating rapidly on both sides of the Atlantic. It was around this same period, during the filming of the 1990 crime drama State of Grace, that Oldman is widely believed to have met Uma Thurman. She was still a teenager, already carrying attention from earlier films like Dangerous Liaisons and Henry and June, an industry that seemed more interested in her image than in her craft. He was 12 years older, freshly separated, and moving through one of the most turbulent stretches of his adult life. What happened next surprised almost no one who was watching Hollywood gossip at the time, and yet still manages to surprise people discovering it today. Oldman and Thurman married in September 1990, the same year his divorce from Manville was finalized. It was fast. It was, by most accounts, private, and it did not last. By March 1992, the marriage was over. Oldman and Thurman had been legally married for roughly a year and a half, a number that, on paper, looks almost like a footnote in 2 much longer careers. But short marriages can still leave long shadows, and this one has followed both of them, in different forms, for more than 30 years. Thurman broke her public silence about the marriage first, and only once, in a 1996 interview with Vanity Fair. By then, she was on the verge of becoming one of the defining actresses of her generation, having just delivered her breakout performance in Pulp Fiction. Looking back at her marriage to Oldman, she called it a mistake, but she was careful to add nuance to that word. She described their relationship as intense and sudden, something that site index equals 5-1 ended, as it needed to /site. She also said, in that same conversation, that Oldman was her first love, and that she had no prior relationship experience to measure it against. When asked, half-jokingly, whether dating a man 12 years older had been some kind of rebellion against her father, she laughed the question off rather than engaging with it seriously. That interview has become the primary source almost every retelling of this story leans on, because Thurman has said very little about the marriage publicly since. Decades later, on the podcast Desert Island Discs, she offered a brief additional reflection, describing the period as one where things felt wonderful until they suddenly weren't, a feeling, in her words, of the rug being pulled out from under her. She did not elaborate much further, and no detailed public account exists from her side beyond these scattered remarks. Gary Oldman's most quoted comments on the marriage come from a 2014 interview with Playboy, by which point he had already been married 5 times, and was reflecting, with visible irritation, on how the internet had flattened his biography into a handful of repeatable headlines. He complained that people reduced his entire history to a couple of lines. Son of a welder, once married to Uma Thurman. He said he was tired of it. In that same conversation, he described relationships in general as extremely difficult, joking darkly that some of his marriages felt like they lasted only minutes. And when the conversation turned specifically to Thurman, he said plainly that site index equals 12-1, He does not think their relationship meant very much to either of them/site. That line is the one that keeps resurfacing in headlines every few years, usually stripped of its context. Read on its own. It sounds dismissive, even cruel, given that Thurman had once called him her first love. Read alongside the rest of the interview. It looks more like a man venting frustration at being permanently defined by a fraction of his life he considers ancient history, rather than someone actively minimizing what Thurman felt at the time. Both readings are possible. Neither one is confirmed by anything he has said elsewhere, and Oldman has not, in any verified interview, directly addressed or disputed how Thurman described the relationship. To understand why the marriage collapsed so quickly, it helps to understand what else was happening in Oldman's life during those years. His drinking, which he has spoken about candidly in later interviews, was a serious and ongoing problem throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. He has since described that period of his life in stark terms, calling alcoholism something close to hell, and has said that getting sober, which he did after entering rehab in 1995, ranks among the most difficult and important things he has ever done. That timeline places the end of his marriage to Thurman squarely in the middle of his heaviest drinking years, roughly 3 years before he sought treatment. None of this is offered by either of them as a direct explanation for the divorce. There is no on-record statement from Oldman or Thurman saying the marriage ended specifically because of his drinking. But the overlap in timing is well documented, and it is the kind of context that at least complicates the idea that the relationship was simply a brief, meaningless fling, as Oldman's later comment might suggest. Thurman, for her part, was navigating her own difficult period. She had entered the industry very young, and was still working to be taken seriously as an actress rather than treated primarily as an object of fascination, a tension she has discussed in multiple interviews over the years, separate from her marriage to Oldman. Her marriage unfolded while she was still building the identity that would eventually make her one of the most recognizable actresses of the 1990s, first through her collaborations with Quentin Tarantino on Pulp Fiction, and later, in the 2000s, through Kill Bill. After the divorce, both of their lives moved in very different directions, at least for a while. Oldman went on to a period widely described in press coverage as personally chaotic. He was briefly engaged to Isabella Rossellini between 1994 and 1996. In 1997, he married actress and photographer Danya Fiorentino, with whom he had 2 more sons, Gulliver and Charlie. That marriage ended in 2001 amid a highly contentious divorce. Fiorentino filed court documents alleging domestic violence, which Oldman was investigated for and cleared of, and he was granted sole legal and physical custody of the children, a custody arrangement a judge later revisited in 2003 after finding that certain claims Fiorentino had made against Oldman were not substantiated. In 2018, one of Oldman's sons from that marriage spoke publicly about the difficulty of that period in their family's life. Oldman married 2 more times after that, to singer Alexandra Edinburgh in 2008, a marriage that ended in divorce by 2015 after the couple separated the year before, and to art curator Giselle Schmidt in 2017, a marriage that, as of now, remains intact. He has said in interviews around that 5th marriage that he believed he had finally learned something from his previous relationships, and friends close to him have described the marriage to Schmidt as notably calmer and more stable than what came before. Thurman, meanwhile, married actor Ethan Hawke in 1998. They had 2 children together, Maya, born that same year, and Levon, born in 2002, before separating in 2003 and divorcing in 2005. She has not remarried since. Professionally, the years following her marriage to Oldman were transformative. She became one of Tarantino's most closely associated collaborators, delivering performances that reshaped how she was perceived by both critics and audiences, moving her decisively away from the narrower ingenue image the industry had initially placed on her. So, what is actually being described when headlines call Oldman's Playboy comment a brutal confession? Stripped of embellishment, it is this: a man in his mid-50s, asked repeatedly about a marriage that lasted less than 2 years and ended more than 2 decades earlier, expressing frustration at how permanently that marriage had attached itself to his public identity, and saying he did not think it carried much weight for either person involved. That is a real quote on the record, and it does contrast with how Thurman described the same relationship in 1996 as her first love, as something that mattered enough to still be worth discussing years later, even while she also called it a mistake. Neither of them has offered a fuller, matching account of exactly why the marriage ended. There is no verified joint interview, no detailed mutual retrospective, no confirmed timeline of what specifically went wrong beyond the broad strokes both have shared separately. Her account emphasizing youth, inexperience, and a love affair that burned out the way such things sometimes do. His account emphasizing exhaustion with being reduced to a headline, delivered inside a wider complaint about relationships in general being difficult. It is worth being direct about what is fact and what is inference here. It is a documented fact that they married in September 1990 and divorced by March 1992. It is a documented fact that Thurman called the marriage a mistake and her first love in the same 1996 interview. It is a documented fact that Oldman, in 2014, said he did not think the relationship meant very much to either of them. What is not documented, and what no reliable source confirms, is the specific reason the marriage ended, whose decision it was, or how each of them privately felt about the other in the years between. Any account that fills in those blanks with confident emotional detail is speculation dressed up as biography. What can be said with more confidence is what came after. Oldman's career, following years of both extraordinary acclaim and real personal difficulty, eventually reached a different register entirely. He won the Academy Award for Best Actor in 2018 for his portrayal of Winston Churchill in Darkest Hour, a role that drew on the same transformative intensity that had always defined his work, but delivered from a place of far greater personal stability. In recent years, he has become newly familiar to audiences as the irascible spymaster Jackson Lamb in Slow Horses, a role widely credited with introducing him to a new generation of viewers. Now in his late 60s, sober for roughly 3 decades, and settled in his 5th marriage, Oldman occupies a very different position than the man who briefly married Uma Thurman in 1990. Thurman, too, has continued building a body of work that long ago outgrew any single relationship from her 20s. She remains one of the defining screen presences to emerge from American independent and studio cinema of the 1990s, and she has continued working steadily in film and television since. The reason this marriage still gets discussed more than 3 decades after it ended is not because it was unusually long, dramatic, or well documented. It is because both people involved eventually became famous enough that even their briefest chapters get re-examined. 2 teenagers turned legends colliding early, before either had become who they would eventually be, is the kind of detail that public curiosity does not easily let go of, even when, as is the case here, the honest answer to what really happened is that we only have 2 short, separately given accounts, given years apart, that do not fully agree with each other and were never meant to form a complete story. Thurman called it her first love, and a mistake in the same breath. Oldman called it something that did not mean much, while venting about being defined by his own history. Both statements are real. Neither one, on its own, tells the whole story, and no one outside that marriage is in a position to say which account carries more emotional truth. That, ultimately, is the more honest version of this story. Not a dramatic confession that reveals some hidden truth about either star, but 2 people, interviewed years apart, describing the same brief marriage in 2 different registers, one wistful, one weary, and a public that has spent more than 30 years trying to reconcile the 2.